The tires of the car crunched over gravel as Emily and Mark pulled up to the small, secluded cabin nestled deep within the towering trees. The forest loomed around them, its silence only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves. Emily stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cool, pine-scented air. It felt refreshing, a welcome change from the suffocating buzz of the city. "This is perfect," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She grabbed her camera from the back seat, already planning the shots she would take of the wild landscape. Markon, however, seemed distant. He glanced nervously at the line of trees, his jaw tight. "Yeah, it's peaceful," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Emily didn't notice. Her focus had shifted entirely to the beauty of the surrounding woods. The cabin was simple but cozy, built from dark wood with large windows that overlooked the forest. It felt like they had stepped into another world, one untouched by time or progress. As Emily unpacked inside, she felt a growing sense of wonder. There was something almost magical about being so isolated, surrounded by nature. The whispers of the trees seemed to call her, drawing her deeper into their embrace. That evening, as they explored the area around the cabin, Emily came across strange markings on the trees. Symbols ancient and crude, carved into the bark as though they had been there for centuries. "Look at these, Mark," she said, running her fingers over the rough carvings. "They're beautiful in a haunting sort of way." Mark glanced at them briefly, his expression tightening. "Probably just some old tribal markings," he said dismissively, trying to steer her away. "Nothing to worry about." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You don't find this even a little bit curious? These carvings, they look like they've been here forever." She took out her camera and snapped a few pictures, eager to capture the eerie beauty. Mark forced a smile. "I guess, but let's not get too caught up in local folklore, okay? We came here to relax." As they walked back to the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around them. The air grew heavier, and an unsettling quiet descended. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she turned on, there was nothing but trees swaying in the gentle breeze. That night, as the fire crackled in the fireplace and they settled in for the evening, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the markings. There was something ancient and powerful about them, something that tugged at the edges of her mind. Mark, on the other hand, seemed distracted, constantly glancing out the window toward the forest. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing his unease. "Yeah," he said, a little too quickly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Emily shrugged, not wanting to push him. She told herself it was just the unfamiliar environment making them both a little tense. But as they drifted off to sleep, the wind outside seemed to carry whispers through the trees, and Emily couldn't help but feel that something in the forest had noticed their presence. The next morning, Emily woke up to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin windows. Mark was still asleep, his face tense even in rest. She slipped out of bed quietly, grabbed her camera, and decided to explore more of the forest while the air was still cool and crisp. The forest felt different in the morning light, calmer, but the strange sense of being watched still lingered at the back of her mind. Emily followed a narrow path that twisted deeper into the woods. Every so often, she came across more of those strange carvings, some faded, others as sharp and fresh as if they had just been made. They seemed to be leading her somewhere. After walking for what felt like hours, Emily found herself in a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, partially covered in moss and leaves, as if nature itself had tried to reclaim it. The sight stopped her in her tracks. The markings on the stones were the same as those on the trees, but here, they were more intricate, more deliberate. She stepped closer, running her hand over the cold stone. "What is this place?" she murmured to herself. The air here felt different, thicker somehow, and a chill ran down her spine despite the warmth of the sun. She raised her camera, capturing every detail of the altar, every carving. There was something almost ritualistic about it, as if it had been used for something more than just decoration. Emily's mind raced with questions. Was this tied to the local legends the villagers had mentioned? The Shadow Guardian. The name echoed in her head, though she couldn't remember where she'd heard it. Suddenly, she heard a twig snap behind her. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she spun around only to find Mark standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting between her and the altar. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice strained. "I was just exploring. I found this altar," she replied, waving toward the stone. "It's incredible. Have you seen this before?" Mark stepped closer, but he didn't look at the altar. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on her, as if he was weighing his next words carefully. "Yeah, I've seen it. It's nothing, really. Just some old ruin. We should head back." Emily frowned. "It doesn't feel like nothing. There's something strange about this place. The carvings, they're everywhere, and they seem connected to this." Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he was going to argue with her. But then he sighed. "Look, it's just some old folklore. The villagers make up stories to scare people away from this place. It's probably not safe. Let's go." Reluctantly, Emily agreed, though her curiosity burned brighter than ever. As they walked back to the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something. His reaction had been too quick, too dismissive. He knew more than he was letting on. That night, as the fire crackled again and darkness fell over the cabin, Emily lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of the altar. What had it been used for, and why had Mark been so eager to leave? She glanced at him, asleep beside her, his face calm but distant. Something wasn't right. The wind outside the cabin picked up as night deepened, making the trees sway like dark figures dancing in the shadows. Emily lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the wooden cabin made her pulse quicken. Something about the day's events left her feeling uneasy, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, the sense of being watched had only grown stronger since she'd discovered the altar. Mark had fallen asleep quickly, but Emily was too restless. She got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him, and moved toward the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the forest, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. Then, she heard it. A faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind, drifted through the air. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it came again, soft, but unmistakable. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she strained to hear. The whispers seemed to come from deep within the forest, carried on the wind like secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced over at Mark, still asleep, completely unaware. She hesitated for a moment, then slipped on her shoes and grabbed her flashlight. Something was calling her. She had to know what it was. Outside, the air was colder than she expected, and the forest seemed even more imposing under the pale moonlight. Every step she took made her more aware of how isolated they were. The whispers continued, growing louder as she ventured further from the cabin, but they never seemed to form actual words, just an eerie, breathless sound that seemed to beckon her closer. She followed the path that led back toward the clearing with the altar, her flashlight cutting through the dense shadows. As she approached the clearing, the whispers abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the voices had been. Emily stood there, the beam of her flashlight sweeping over the ancient stones of the altar, now bathed in moonlight. She felt like she was being watched. No, not watched. Studied. The air around her grew thick, heavy with an unnatural tension, and her instincts screamed at her to leave. But before she could turn back, she heard something behind her, a rustling in the trees. Emily spun around, her flashlight flickering over the underbrush. At first, she saw nothing, but then she caught a glimpse of a shadow, a figure, tall and indistinct, moving silently between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she called out softly, her voice trembling. There was no response, only silence. She stood frozen for a long moment, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen the shadow. Had it been her imagination? Just the play of light and shadows in the dense forest? She wasn't sure, but the fear gnawing at her stomach was real. Too real. Just as she was about to turn back, a branch snapped somewhere behind her. This time, She didn't wait. She bolted, running back through the trees toward the cabin, her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers had started again, growing louder with each step she took, as if they were chasing her. By the time she reached the cabin, she was breathless, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the door. She slammed it shut behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. Inside, the cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying fire in the hearth. Mark was still in bed, but as she stood there trying to calm herself, she realized something wasn't right. He wasn't moving. He wasn't snoring like he usually did. Her stomach dropped. "Mark," she whispered, stepping closer. He stirred slightly, then sat up slowly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. For a moment, it was as if he didn't recognize her. "Emily," he muttered, his voice groggy. "I heard something outside," she said, her voice shaking. "There was someone in the forest." Mark rubbed his eyes, clearly still half asleep. "It's probably just the wind. You're letting those stories get to you." "No, it wasn't the wind," Emily insisted. "There was someone watching me." Mark looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. "You're imagining things. Get some rest." But as Emily climbed back into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Mark was acting strange, distant, and the whispers, they had felt so real. As she closed her eyes, a single thought echoed in her mind. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with them yet. The following morning, Emily awoke with a sense of dread lingering over her. The night's events haunted her thoughts, making the cabin feel more like a prison than a retreat. Mark had already gotten up and was making coffee, but there was a distance between them, an invisible wall that hadn't been there before. She watched him for a moment, noting the way his eyes avoided hers, the tension in his movements. Something was off, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. "I need to go back to the altar," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mark froze for a second, his back to her, before turning slowly. "Why?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "There's something strange going on here, and I'm not going to ignore it anymore. That altar, the markings, the whispers I heard last night, something's not right." Mark shook his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're just spooking yourself. There's nothing out there, Emily. We should stay close to the cabin, relax, that's why we came here, right?" But Emily wasn't convinced. There was something in the way he spoke, a forced calm that only deepened her suspicion. "I'm going," she said firmly, grabbing her camera and a small bag with essentials. "You don't have to come, but I need to know what's happening." Mark stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but don't take too long." As Emily walked out into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had wanted her to stay for a reason. His reaction wasn't that of someone worried about her safety. It was as if he was trying to keep her from discovering something. The thought gnawed at her as she made her way back to the clearing. The forest felt heavier today, darker despite the bright sunlight filtering through the trees. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves under her boots, the distant call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching her. When she finally reached the altar, she hesitated. The ancient stones seemed even more foreboding in the light of day, and the carvings, once fascinating, now felt ominous. Emily stepped closer, her fingers brushing the rough surface of the stone, tracing the strange symbols. She could feel the power in them, something old and dangerous. That's when she noticed it, a small, weathered book tucked into a crevice beneath the altar. Her heart raced as she pulled it out, the leather worn and brittle. It was a journal, ancient by the looks of it, the pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through it, her breath caught in her throat. The journal told the story of a family, Mark's family. Centuries ago, they had lived near this very forest and had become entangled in dark rituals. The altar had been a place of sacrifice, offerings made to appease the Shadow Guardian, an ancient entity that watched over the forest. The Guardian had protected the family in exchange for sacrifices, but the price was steep. Over generations, The family had been cursed to maintain the pact or face the wrath of the Guardian. Emily's hands shook as she read the final entries, detailing how one of the family members had tried to break the curse by leaving the forest behind, only to be hunted down by the Guardian. The curse had never been broken, and it was passed down from generation to generation. Her stomach churned. Mark knew about this. He had to. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He had brought her here, knowing the history of the altar, of the Guardian. But why? She closed the journal, her mind racing. She needed answers. Without another thought, she turned and rushed back toward the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the clearing around the cabin, she saw Mark standing outside, his face pale. He saw the journal in her hand, and his expression darkened. "Where did you find that?" His voice was low, dangerous. "At the altar," she said, her voice trembling. "You knew, didn't you? About your family, about the curse. You brought me here for a reason." Mark stepped toward her, his face tight with anger. "You weren't supposed to find that." "Why, Mark?" Emily demanded, backing away. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Because I didn't have a choice," he snapped. "You think I wanted this, the curse? It follows us, Emily. My family has tried to outrun it for generations, but it always catches up. I thought maybe this time would be different." "Different how?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could break it," Mark said, his voice trembling now. "I thought maybe, if I brought you here, if we—" Emily's blood ran cold. "If we what, Mark? If you sacrificed me?" "No!" Mark's face twisted in anguish. "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't want to. I just thought maybe if I brought someone, the Guardian would take them instead. I thought it would be enough to free me." Emily took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. She had trusted him, and now she realized he had planned to use her as a way out, to save himself. Her chest tightened with fear and betrayal. "Emily, please," Mark said, his voice desperate. "I didn't have a choice." But Emily's eyes were locked on him, cold and unforgiving. "You made your choice the moment you brought me here." Before Mark could respond, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of whispers, low and menacing. The Guardian was close. The wind howled around them, carrying the whispers of the forest as if the very trees were alive with the voices of the past. Emily could feel it. Something was coming. The atmosphere shifted, growing heavier with each passing second. The Guardian was close, and she had never felt so vulnerable. Mark stood frozen, his face pale as he stared into the dense trees surrounding them. His desperate plea to Emily hung in the air, but the weight of his betrayal was too much for her to bear. She backed away from him, her mind racing for an escape, though the forest felt like a trap, enclosing her in its twisted embrace. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a shift in the way the light hit the trees. But soon the darkness itself seemed to come alive. The shadowy figure from the night before appeared, emerging from the depths of the forest like a wraith. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees, as if it was part of the forest itself. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer, its steps silent yet heavy with menace. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with a cold shock that they were not just noise, they were words, ancient, foreign, but unmistakably clear. Sacrifice. The word echoed in her mind, and Emily's stomach churned. The Guardian was here for its payment. Mark stepped forward, his face a mask of fear and resignation. "It's me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Take me. End this." But the Guardian's hollow gaze remained fixed on Emily, as if Mark's offer meant nothing. Emily realized Roman with growing horror that the Guardian had already chosen. "No," she whispered, backing further away. "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this." Mark turned to her, his face filled with anguish. "Emily, I'm sorry, I thought..." You thought you could trade me for your freedom, Emily spat, the betrayal cutting deeper than any fear she had felt. You used me. I didn't mean to, Mark said, his voice breaking. I was desperate. This curse, it's been in my family for generations. I thought if I brought someone... Emily's blood turned to ice. You mean, if you brought me, she corrected. You thought you could trick the Guardian into taking me instead of you. Mark's silence was all the confirmation she needed. The Guardian took another step forward, its presence almost unbearable now. The air around it seemed to warp, distorting the very space it occupied. Emily could feel its power, ancient and overwhelming. She was nothing but a pawn in its eyes, another sacrifice to keep the cycle going. But something stirred within her, a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let Mark, or this thing, decide her fate. She wasn't going to die here. In a moment of clarity, Emily remembered the journal she had found at the altar. The entries spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, but also of a way to end the curse. The Guardian thrived on fear and submission, but what if it could be bargained with? What if there was a way to turn the tables? You want a sacrifice, Emily called out, her voice trembling but resolute. I offer you one. Mark turned to her, his eyes wide with shock. What are you doing? Ignoring him, Emily took a step toward the Guardian, her heart pounding in her chest. You can take him, she said, her voice louder now. Take Mark. He's the one tied to your curse. He's the one whose family has failed you. Take him, and end this. The Guardian paused, the shadows around it swirling as if contemplating her words. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, filling Emily's mind with chaos. Mark staggered back, his face pale. Emily, no, please. But Emily stood her ground, her eyes locked on the Guardian. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to be sacrificed for someone else's sins. For what felt like an eternity, the Guardian remained still, the air thick with tension. Then slowly, it turned its gaze toward Mark. The whispers shifted, and the air grew colder. Mark took a step back, his body trembling. No! He screamed, but his voice was lost in the wind as the shadows surged toward him. The Guardian moved with unnatural speed, its form dissolving into darkness as it wrapped around Mark. His screams echoed through the forest, filled with terror and regret, but they were short-lived. The shadows swallowed him whole, and then there was silence. The forest stood still. The wind died down, and the whispers faded into nothingness. Emily stood frozen, her body shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. The Guardian was gone, Mark was gone, and she was still alive. For a long moment, she didn't move, her mind reeling from the shock. Then, slowly, she sank to her knees, the weight of it all crashing down on her. The betrayal, the fear, the horror, it was too much. But as she sat there, breathing heavily in the silence of the forest, a strange sense of peace washed over her. The Guardian had made its choice. The curse had been broken. She was free. Emily sat in the clearing for what felt like hours, her mind numb from the ordeal. The forest around her was unnervingly quiet now, as though the very land had taken a deep breath after centuries of tension. The Guardian had vanished, and with it, the weight of the curse seemed to lift. But the air still felt thick, and a strange unease gnawed at her. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling. Mark was gone, consumed by the shadows, and with him, all the anger and betrayal she had felt seemed to dissipate into the ether. She was alone now, truly alone in this vast ancient forest, but she wasn't the same person who had entered these woods just days ago. The weight of what she had survived was heavy, but she was still standing. The cabin wasn't far, and as Emily made her way back, the memory of Mark's final scream echoed in her ears. She tried to push it away, but it clung to her like the damp chill in the air. She had done what she had to do to survive, but the guilt was already sinking in. As she approached the cabin, a strange sight caught her eye. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. She hadn't left it like that. A fresh wave of dread washed over her, and she instinctively reached for the flashlight in her bag, though she wasn't sure what good it would do in the growing darkness. Cautiously, she pushed the door open further, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The cabin looked the same as before, simple, rustic, untouched by the chaos outside, but something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving only cold ashes. The only sound was her own breathing as she stepped further inside. Then she noticed it. On the table, where they had shared their last meal, lay the journal. The same journal she had found at the altar, but now it was open. Its pages fluttering slightly, as though an invisible hand had turned them. Emily's heart raced as she approached the table. She had left the journal hidden in her bag. There was no way it should be here. Her fingers hesitated before reaching out to touch it, but curiosity got the better of her. The pages were different now. New writing, fresh and inked in a jagged, hurried script, filled the once empty spaces. Emily's eyes scanned the words, her breath catching as the meaning became clear. The Guardian is never truly gone. The curse was not lifted, only transferred. Her hands shook as she stepped back from the table, her mind reeling. What did that mean? She had seen the Guardian take Mark. She had seen it consume him. How could the curse still remain? As if in response to her thoughts, the air around her grew cold. The familiar whispers returned, but now they felt closer, more invasive, as though they were inside her mind. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, gathering in the corners, watching her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind outside. "It's over. It has to be over." But the words in the journal haunted her. The curse was not lifted, only transferred. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Guardian hadn't disappeared. It hadn't ended the curse. It had simply passed it on, to her. Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair, her mind spiraling. The whispers were growing louder, almost deafening now, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her. She covered her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The curse had found its new host, her. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of it all crashed down on her. She had thought she had escaped, thought she had won, but the Guardian had never intended to let her go. It had simply waited for the right moment to claim her. The shadows around her moved again, swirling in a dance of dark tendrils that seemed to mock her. The whispers took on a new tone, no longer the distant, unintelligible murmurs from before. Now, they were clearer, more insistent. "You belong to us now." Emily clutched the edges of the chair, her mind racing for a way out. There had to be something she could do, some way to break this cycle once and for all. But the shadows continued to close in, the weight of the curse pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. She wasn't going to let it end like this. With a surge of determination, Emily shot to her feet, knocking the chair over in the process. She grabbed the journal from the table, flipping through the pages frantically, searching for any clue that might save her. There had to be something, some way to fight back, but the words blurred in front of her eyes as the shadows crept closer. The cabin seemed to grow darker with each passing second, the walls closing in around her. The whispers grew to a fever pitch, filling her mind with their demands. "Submit." "No," Emily whispered, her voice shaking but defiant. "I won't." With one last glance at the journal, she made a decision. She would return to the altar. There, she would confront the Guardian one last time. If she was going to be taken, it wouldn't be without a fight. The cold night air hit Emily like a slap as she rushed out of the cabin. The journal clutched tightly in her hands. The shadows seemed to follow her, creeping along the ground and wrapping around the trees like dark tendrils. The whispers never stopped, growing louder and more frantic as she moved further into the forest. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, but she didn't slow down. The path to the altar was etched into her mind now, each step bringing her closer to the heart of the forest. The curse was still with her, inside her. She could feel it, heavy and suffocating, pressing on her chest, but she wasn't going to give in. The moonlight barely broke through the thick canopy above, leaving most of the forest shrouded in darkness. Emily kept moving, her flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die, but she couldn't afford to stop. The altar was her only hope, her last chance to break free from this nightmare. As she stumbled into the clearing where the ancient stone altar stood, Emily felt the air grow colder. The shadows around the clearing seemed to pulse with a life of their own, circling the altar like a predator stalking its prey. The Guardian was here. She could feel it. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the altar. The journal's words echoed in her mind, their warning clear. The curse hadn't been lifted, it had only been passed on to her. The weight of the realization was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't stop now. She had come too far. Standing before the altar, Emily opened the journal to the page where the fresh writing had appeared. Her fingers trembled as she read the words again. The Guardian is never truly gone. The curse was not lifted, only transferred. She placed the journal on the altar, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "I know what you want." The air around her grew heavier, thicker, as if the very forest was holding its breath. The shadows that had been swirling around the altar began to coalesce, forming a dark, towering figure. The Guardian. It was even more imposing now, its form a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. The whispers grew louder, filling Emily's mind with their demands. Submit. Accept your fate. But Emily wasn't here to submit. She was here to fight. "I'm not like the others," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't let you control me." The Guardian's presence seemed to pulse, the shadows around it growing darker, denser. It took a step toward her, the ground beneath it shifting as though the forest itself bent to its will. Emily's heart pounded, fear gnawing at her, but she stood her ground. "I know what you are," she continued, her voice rising. "You feed on fear, on submission. But I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore." The shadows paused, swirling in agitation as if they didn't know what to make of her defiance. For a moment, the whispers faltered, replaced by a low, almost questioning murmur. "I'm not going to run," Emily said, taking a step closer to the altar. "I'm not going to let you take me." The Guardian loomed above her, its shadowy form towering over the ancient altar. The wind whipped through the clearing, carrying with it the sounds of the forest, the creaking of trees, and the rustling of leaves. But Emily stood firm, her eyes locked on the dark figure before her. "You took Mark," she said, her voice steady. "You took his family, but you won't take me." With a surge of determination, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the lighter she had brought with her. She held it up, her eyes blazing with defiance. The Guardian seemed to recoil slightly, its form flickering in the face of her resistance. "This ends now," she whispered, flicking the lighter and holding the flame close to the journal. The whispers rose in a chaotic crescendo, the shadows swirling violently around the clearing as if trying to stop her. But Emily didn't hesitate. She threw the lighter onto the journal, watching as the flames took hold, spreading quickly across the brittle pages. The moment the flames touched the journal, the air in the clearing shifted. The shadows recoiled, pulling away from the altar as the fire grew brighter. The whispers became frantic, desperate, but Emily stood her ground, watching as the flames consumed the journal. For a moment, it felt like the forest itself was fighting back, the wind howling, the trees creaking under the strain. But then slowly the shadows began to dissipate. The whispers faded, growing weaker with each passing second until they were nothing more than a faint echo in the distance. Emily watched in stunned silence as the dark figure of the Guardian flickered, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The shadows around it dissipated, and for the first time since she had entered the forest, the air felt lighter. The weight of the curse was lifting. The fire on the altar burned brightly for a few more moments before dying down, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. The journal was gone. The curse was broken. Emily stood there, her chest heaving, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. For the first time in days, she felt free. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet. Emily stood in the clearing for a long time, staring at the remains of the journal as the last embers flickered out. The air felt different now, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from the world. The darkness that had clung to the trees like a living thing was gone, and the whispers that had once haunted her mind had finally fallen silent. It was over. She had won. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a deep exhaustion settled over her. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling from the sheer emotional toll of everything that had happened. She had come to this forest seeking peace, a temporary escape from the chaos of her life. But what she had found was something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. And yet, here she was, still standing. Slowly, she turned and began the long walk back to the cabin. The path felt different now, less oppressive, though the weight of what had happened still clung to her like a shadow. The Guardian was gone, but the memories of what she had faced would stay with her forever. As she approached the cabin, Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a graveyard, haunted by the ghost of Mark and the choices he had made. His betrayal still stung, but more than that, his desperation lingered in her mind. He had been trapped, just like his ancestors. And in the end, his own fear had consumed him. Emily paused at the door of the cabin, her hand hovering over the handle. She wasn't sure if she wanted to go inside, to face the memories of their last moments together, but she knew she had to. There were still things she needed to collect, and then she could leave this place behind for good. The interior of the cabin was just as she had left it, cold, empty, untouched by the supernatural chaos outside. The fire in the hearth had long since burned out, leaving only ashes, much like the altar in the forest. Emily moved through the space quickly, gathering her belongings with a detached efficiency. She wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. As she packed her things, her mind wandered back to the journal, to the final moments when she had faced the Guardian. She had expected to feel relief, but what she felt was something more complicated. The Guardian was gone, but it had been part of this place for so long, its presence woven into the very fabric of the forest. She had destroyed it, but in doing so, she had also destroyed something ancient, something that had existed long before she or Mark had ever set foot in these woods. It was a strange feeling, one that she couldn't quite shake. With her bag packed, Emily slung it over her shoulder and took one last look around the cabin. The memories of the past few days flashed before her, Mark's smile, the quiet evenings by the fire, the growing tension as the truth had begun to unravel. It felt like a lifetime ago now. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the forest, and for the first time since she had arrived, the trees seemed peaceful. The oppressive darkness that had once clung to the landscape was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. It was as though the forest itself was breathing again, free from the weight of the curse that had bound it for so long. Emily walked slowly down the path that led away from the cabin, her footsteps quiet on the soft earth. As she reached the edge of the clearing, she paused and turned to look back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, silent and still, a relic of a time that was now over. She wasn't sure how she felt about leaving. Part of her wanted to get as far away from this place as possible, to forget everything that had happened here. But another part of her felt drawn to it, as though the forest had become a part of her, just as she had become a part of its story. The Guardian was gone, but the forest would always remember. With a deep breath, Emily turned and began the long walk back towards civilization. The path was clearer now, the trees less imposing, and the shadows that had once seemed to watch her every move were nowhere to be seen. She walked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant call of birds. As the forest thinned and the road back to the village came into view, Emily allowed herself to think about what came next. She had survived something impossible, something few would ever believe, but she had also learned something important, that fear could be overcome, that even in the face of darkness there was always a choice. The road stretched out before her, and for the first time in days, Emily felt a sense of hope. The shadows were behind her now, and the future, though uncertain, was hers to shape. With one last glance back at the forest, Emily stepped onto the road and walked away, leaving the haunted woods and everything that had happened within them behind. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.